The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Thanks for coming back. I'm still Jennifer Cooper. I'm here to talk to you today about comprehension. At the beginning of the session today, I did pass out the handout for today's lecture. I know we had some people trickle in perhaps after I'd done that, so if you didn't receive a copy of that, if you'll raise your hand, I'm sure that Dr. Hirschman or Dr. Odegaard would be happy to get one of the handouts for today's lecture and bring it to you off of that side table. It looks a lot like yesterday's lecture in that it has circles on the front of it, but I promise the content will be different. Also, you do have a handy-dandy research tab in your notebook, which you probably found yesterday, that you can stick the PowerPoints for my lectures should you want to keep them for some bedtime reading. If you have problems sleeping, then you'll have those at your leisure. So today we're going to pick up talking about comprehension. So we go back to our 5 components of reading, and comprehension is really the last piece of the puzzle, and probably one of the more challenging pieces of the puzzle to solve. So we characterize comprehension, and here this definition does apply to both oral language and to written text. When we think about comprehension processes, we really think about those cognitive processes that underlie comprehension then versus just pulling meaning out of the text per se. But it is the ability to understand language that's been heard or read. And that's not always as easy as it sounds, because comprehension of text requires us to first break the surface code to identify the words that are on the page, to know the literal meaning of those words, to create a text base, and then to create a model of what we are reading, which requires us to apply our background knowledge as well. And so for an example of that, we'll look at a quote from Parallel Journeys, and we'll go into this in a little bit more depth on the next slide. It was a terrific time to be young in Germany if you were a healthy teenager, if you were a patriotic German, if you came from an Aryan, that is non-Jewish family. A glorious future was yours. So as fluent readers, we bring a lot of information to the table. First, we are able to break the surface code. So we recognize the words in the text, the literal words that are there. It was a terrific time to be young in Germany if you were a healthy teenager, if you were a patriotic German, if you came from an Aryan, that is non-Jewish family. A glorious future was yours. So after we've decoded the text successfully, then we need to create a text base. Do we understand the literal meaning of the text? Do we know what all of the words in the text mean? Because that certainly could impede our comprehension. And if this is as far as we get, then we know that if I'm a young, healthy teenager, I have a glorious future ahead of me. And this might be the mental image that we construct from that text. But of course, as experienced readers who have a wide level of background knowledge, we know that that's not really enough to understand what this particular sentence says. We need to construct our situation model. And so in our situation model, we apply our background knowledge to what we're reading in order to create comprehension for the author's meaning of what that particular statement said. So that requires us to incorporate our background knowledge along with the literal meaning of the text, to infer the author's intent, and to understand the irony that's inherent in that particular quote. We need to understand that if you're not young, if you're not healthy, if you are Jewish, then perhaps your future is not quite so glorious. So that is what goes into the comprehension processes in understanding the text on the page and the author's intent as they write to us, the reader. So I'm sure you've seen the skilled model of reading developed by Scarborough. If we think of the simple view of reading, which we'll look at in just a minute, we know that we have decoding skills that go into it, and we know that we have language skills, language comprehension skills that go into it. So I know it's no surprise to anyone in this room that it really helps if you can decode the words on the page, and Captain Obvious is shocked that we have to be able to decode those words. And so the skills that go into word recognition, of course, are phonological awareness, the ability to decode beyond the phoneme grapheme level at the syllable level, and of course sight word recognition as well. But we also need to consider those language comprehension processes. So we need to have that requisite background knowledge. We need to have a wide enough and deep enough vocabulary base to understand the words that the author has chosen to use to describe, to explain. We need to be able to break down those language structures. We need to know syntax. We need to know semantics. And we need to have verbal reasoning skills. We need to be able to make inferences. We need to be able to make connections within the text, as well as having just basic literacy knowledge on the difference between an expository text and what skills I'll need to apply as I read expository text versus the skills that I'll need to bring to the table if I'm reading a short story or a poem. So oral language competence does matter. This is your one joke, so I'll let you read it for a second so you can enjoy it. So children with higher oral language competence, particularly phonological, semantic competence, they become more skilled readers. They do better in the classroom. They're better able to engage with their peers in conversation, to communicate their needs or understanding or lack of understanding to their teachers. And when it comes to actually parsing text, they're able to draw those inferences, to make the connections, to generate predictions, to understand sarcasm and humor and irony and all of those things that are very critical when it comes to comprehending text. So oral language constrains reading comprehension, which is to say that as proficient as you are at listening comprehension, at communication, at recognizing sarcasm in language and humor in language, which if you're in my family, you're really good at the sarcasm piece, to understand that it's that oral language skill development that is constraining comprehension, because oral language, but rather, I should say but, not because, written language is more complex than our oral language. We don't necessarily speak in complex sentences. We speak in short phrases. We get a lot of nonverbal communication when we're speaking to each other, our facial expressions. I don't have any, but I think most people do have facial expressions. Our body language. So we have a lot of nonverbal communication going on, plus we have the ability to clarify understanding. I didn't get what you said. I'm going to ask you. I'm going to look confused. And you're going to explain yourself to me. We don't necessarily have that ability with written language. We don't usually get to question the author, even though that's one of our comprehension strategies that we encourage our readers to engage in. We have these decontextualized ideas. We have to use more words. We have to use a richer vocabulary to get our meaning across to the reader, who we have one shot as we write this sentence, this paragraph, this story, to really get our message across. So we have that complexity of language and written language that makes the comprehension of written text a little more challenging than oral language comprehension. So we look at the meta-linguistic skills that go into comprehension. We need to be able to recognize the sounds, manipulate the sounds, attach meaning to the sounds in our language. We need to be able to interpret those non-literal meanings, so to draw inferences, to digest figurative language. We need to be able to reflect on whether we're getting it when we read the text. Are we comprehending what we've read? Do we need to do something to go repair the breakdown in comprehension, to both detect and repair the breakdown in comprehension? Of course, those are all processes in comprehension monitoring, which is something that skilled readers do automatically. So we look at the factors that go into both language and reading development. We have biological factors. For reading disabilities, we know there's a high genetic correlation. If you have a family member who has a reading disability, you are more likely to have a reading disability. We know there's environmental factors that go into both oral language development and reading development. So the richness of the language in your home, the quantity, the quality, the nature of the language that a child experiences long before they ever come to you as a teacher is a crucial factor in developing oral language competence, vocabulary knowledge, the pragmatic skills that go and facilitate academic success. From an environmental standpoint that you are in control over, we know that instruction is a huge factor in the development of both oral language and reading comprehension. So we need to have that solid, systematic Core 1, Tier 1 rather, instruction in place to adequately develop reading and oral language. We know that psychosocial factors come into play. a child's motivation for reading, their persistence in the process of learning to read, particularly if they encounter reading difficulties, is a very crucial factor. Their ability to attend to the text, so if they have attention deficit issues. And then finally, we have their cognitive abilities. Can they maintain that information in working memory long enough to process the meaning of the text? Their phonological awareness, is that intact? Their phonological processing. So we know that those factors contribute. If we look at the difference again between spoken and written language, we have very similar processes that go on. We have to have that linguistic competence. We need to be able to understand the semantics and the syntax of the language. We have our cognitive processes. We have to think about what's going on and do we understand it. We are comprehension monitoring there also, and we're following along the conversation. And we're using our background knowledge to make sense of what we're encountering both in oral language and in text. But with written language, again, because we have that additional complexity, we have to also apply some metacognitive skills to the process of comprehension. We have to think about our thinking. Are we thinking correctly? Are we making the connections between the text? Do we see this event coming? Do we understand the author's intent, the information that they're trying to communicate? So some cognitive skills that go into reading comprehension are making connections to background knowledge, the ability to compare and contrast ideas, the ability to summarize ideas, to identify the main idea, setting a purpose to read, why am I engaging in this text, maintaining the motivation to engage in this text, particularly if it's not a text that I've picked, but that my teacher has given me and said, here, read this. And our metacognitive strategies that go into reading comprehension are monitoring our comprehension, clarifying meaning if we're not sure of what the word means or what the author meant, using fix-up strategies like rereading, drawing inferences, predicting, and then changing our hypothesis based on the new information that we encounter, whether that's in a narrative text or an expository text. Also contributing to the puzzle of reading comprehension are reader, task, and text factors. Our reader factors that go into reading comprehension are the reader's ability. Are they successful and fluent decoders, or are they still struggling with that level of reading? Are they motivated to read the text? And do they have a lot of experience reading? Are they wide readers? Do they bring a lot of situational knowledge to the table, or do they have a limited reading experience or a limited background experience where they are going to have difficult understanding the text that's in front of them depending on what is in that text? The text factors that contribute to reading comprehension is the level of complexity of the text at the reader's level, or is it above their level? Is it too easy for them so they get bored with it and put it aside, or is it too challenging for them? And do they have the appropriate knowledge base in order to attack and understand the text? So there have been studies that have demonstrated that you can take a below average reader and an average or an above average reader, and if you put a text in front of each of those students that has a very specialized background knowledge, sports for instance, if you have a low average reader who's very knowledgeable about the content, they will outperform the average or above average reader who doesn't know anything about that subject. So what's in the text and how that interacts with the reader's knowledge base really does factor into the reading comprehension process. And then finally, we have those task level factors. The level of support or scaffolding that the student receives from the teacher. Are they given a text and say, here, read this, and then answer these questions? Or are we engaging in discussion about what's going on in the text? And obviously, the level of text complexity and the reader's ability, all of those factors go into how much scaffolding and support our students need. Are we instructing them on the strategies that will help them comprehend this text and help them be successful in reading comprehension? So we're back to the simple view of reading framework, just to think about where large groups of our readers may fall and the processes, or rather the causes that underlie having deficits in one of those areas, and then what each of those students might need. So we typically classify good readers as readers who have both good decoding or good word reading skills and, of course, average or above average listening comprehension. Fluency and the processes that go into fluency. Specifically, we talked about rapid automatic naming. So we know that students with dyslexia, some potential causes for that are deficits in the phonological processing, which I think reiterates what Tim said earlier. Phonological awareness, phonological memory, and rapid automatic naming. Deficits in those areas contribute to those difficulties with decoding. But if we look again below the grid, since our focus is on comprehension today, students with comprehension deficits, we think about their oral language development. Did they have delayed oral language development? We think about their environment. Was the quality of the language input that they received and the quantity sufficient to promote adequate oral language development, to build adequate background knowledge and adequate vocabulary knowledge? So we know that students who don't receive adequate quality and quantity and input of oral language in their home environment before they ever come to you as kindergartners can come to you with a 30 million word deficit, meaning they have been exposed to 30 million less words cumulatively than the student who comes to you with an average oral language background. We also need to consider the student's experience. I'm sure you've heard of the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, that works really well with reading, as Stanovich pointed out, I think in his 1991 work. It might have been earlier than that. So those students who read easily tend to read more because it's easier for them, and because they tend to read more, they become more skilled at reading, more skilled at decoding, more skilled at those comprehension processes. Those students who struggle with reading, either from a decoding or a comprehension standpoint, don't enjoy the process, and so they don't engage in the process very much. So now we have reduced experience, reduced opportunity to learn, reduced opportunity to practice. And so we have both of those things going on as we consider that simple view of reading framework. But I'd like for us to consider the simple view of reading framework another way. I'd like for us to consider what we can provide to those students to help them be successful in reading comprehension. So for students with dyslexia who may have weaker decoding skills, they still have those average listening skills, those average oral language skills. And so those students will benefit from the opportunity to engage, even if it's to engage through listening to texts that are at their grade or age or maturity level, which will typically be higher than their decoding level, because engaging in those types of materials continues to build those comprehension processes. It also creates motivation for engaging with text. I think I heard several people yesterday talking about those baby words and how our older readers get very frustrated when we put them in younger materials, even if that's where their decoding level is. So we can circumvent that to a degree by allowing them to engage in text auditorily and have those discussions that build that background knowledge, to hear those rich words that are included in more complex written texts, and to foster hopefully a love for stories, which will maybe translate into a love for reading, particularly as we pull those decoding skills up to where they need to be. If we consider students with poor comprehension, those students can improve their comprehension if we put in their hands and in their heads the specific strategies that we as fluent readers implicitly apply when we read a text that is a little bit challenging for us. What they require, of course, is explicit comprehension in the use of those strategies. You've developed them over the course of your reading experience, and you probably developed them implicitly as a competent, typically developing reader. Our readers who struggle with word decoding, or our readers who struggle with comprehension, they aren't quite so fortunate. They didn't develop those skills, either because they don't have the requisite background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge, semantic knowledge, syntactic knowledge to bring to the table. So it's very challenging for them, so they don't think about what strategies I can apply. I'm just trying to get through this text and make some sense out of it. And our poor decoders who put so much of their cognitive resources into pulling the literal words off the page, that we need to provide that support to them through explicit instruction and comprehension strategies, so that they have those strategic resources in their arsenal with which to comprehend text. And of course, even our typical readers benefit from direct systematic instruction and comprehension skills and strategies in that comprehension process. All of our readers have the ability to benefit for that. So this is something that you can use as a Tier 1 practice, a Tier 2 practice, and a Tier 3 practice. So we go back to our model of skilled reading, just to touch on this one more time. We need to have those word recognition skills in place. That is definitely an important part of the reading comprehension puzzle. And they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. It's not just enough to be able to decode, as those of you who mentioned having those beautiful word callers who could understand nothing that they had read. It's not enough just to be able to read the words off the page. We do have to bring to bear our background knowledge, our vocabulary knowledge, those verbal comprehension processes that underscore oral language comprehension. This also is necessary, but it's insufficient. You have to have both pieces in place, and those processes need to become increasingly automatic in terms of decoding, and they need to become increasingly strategic in terms of applying those comprehension processes to text. And only through that can we create those skilled readers who have both necessary and sufficient skills in order to pull meaning from a text, which of course is the goal of reading. So if we look at comprehension instruction and what research says works for comprehension instruction, we see very large effect sizes in comprehension programs. So programs that are specifically meant to build a comprehension in students. In metacognitive instruction, where we make explicit how we think about thinking, what processes skilled readers go through. Reciprocal teaching, where students can engage in dialogue with their peers who perhaps understand the material a little bit better and hear how they're thinking through the text and walking through the text and having it explained that way, and getting to build that knowledge base through that engagement and discussion. And of course, vocabulary instruction, because we know that vocabulary and reading comprehension are extremely highly correlated. So when we can improve that student's vocabulary base, particularly if they have a deficit in that area, then we can boost their ability to comprehend text. So we know that students who learn strategies outperform controls who didn't learn those same strategies on both immediate and transfer measures. So if we provide our students with explicit strategy instruction, they have the ability to hold on to those strategies and to use those strategies in novel text. And it is particularly useful for our learning disabled students because they may not have as many of those strategies implicitly available, and so they really benefit from that explicit instruction in, hey, this is how the reading process works. So the instruction of comprehension skills and strategies should be direct and explicit. The features of that instruction, it should include very heavy modeling on the part of the teacher. So the students have multiple opportunities to see what fluent reading comprehension processes look like in play. That's not very natural for many of us to talk through a text. We're used to reading and thinking, and it's a silent and a personal activity. But unfortunately, just like we can't see what's going on in their heads when they read silently, and that's why we have them do fluency aloud, they can't see what's going on in our heads if we read and then just magically generate the answer to this inferential question that we've asked them. And we want to give them feedback when they reach the correct response and when they reach the incorrect response. And we want to point out the details that guide them both to the correct response to our question, our inferential question, our prediction, and we want to point out where they might have gone awry. We want to talk about the connotation and the denotation of words and how context can lead us aright and it can lead us astray. And we want to give them multiple opportunities to practice the supported reading of text and to give them supported practice with the comprehension strategies that we've provided explicit instruction on. So some strategies that we can provide instruction on include predicting and inference questioning. That's both generating questions about the text as well as answering questions about the text. Synthesizing information can be a very useful strategy where they're taking large pieces of text and distilling it down into its essential ideas. Visualizing can be an effective strategy for our students, as well as using schema, so building their concept of what's going on in the story and using what they know and bringing that to bear on the place. They also need skill development in their comprehension instruction. They need to be able to identify main idea, author's purpose, theme, story structure, fact and opinion, point of view, genre, and figurative language. This doesn't necessarily come automatically, so we need to provide, again, that explicit instruction on how you identify the main idea. Where's the main idea usually located at in a paragraph, in a paper, in an essay? What comes below that, those supporting details, those key ideas? How do we distinguish between fact and opinion? What story structure? Thinking about a plot story structure, thinking about not just story structure, but text structure. What does expository text look like? Other skills include cause and effect and summarization. So again, we do want very heavy teacher modeling in comprehension instruction. We want clear explanation with unambiguous examples. We want think alouds, where you're reading the text to them, you're stopping in the process of reading the text. I think this means, I wonder if this relates to, what do you think that word means? You really want to draw their attention to the text structures. In expository text, we want to draw attention to headings. Well, we have this bolded heading here. What can we expect to find in this paragraph? They don't always think about what seems to us perhaps to be overwhelmingly obvious because they're using their cognitive processes in other ways. So we want to bring them back and draw them through the text. So pointing out bold or italicized words, pointing out appositives, where we often find in expository text explanations or definitions for those bold or italicized words or important pieces of information. We want to draw attention to the important ideas in a narrative text. That might be the events, the way a character acts, the characterization of the character, the actions of the character. But when we model this process aloud for them, then they can see the metacognitive skills that we apply when we read the text, and that can give them the opportunity to practice applying those same skills when they read the text. So you do want to be very methodical in providing comprehension instruction. You don't want to overwhelm them with a bunch of strategies. You know the text that you're teaching. What comprehension strategies would be particularly useful for that text? Is it a narrative text? Do we really need to pay attention to character development? Can we predict what's going to happen in the story? What's the expression, there's only one story, we just keep changing the characters, or there's seven different stories, we just keep changing the characters' names and faces. So giving them that concept that texts are predictable and that we're looking for context clues here to figure out what's going to go on down the line so we can be anticipating that can be very useful to them. So we use modeling and thinking aloud because that encourages our students to monitor their own thinking. When they see us modeling, monitoring our thinking, then that becomes a process that they realize should be incorporated into the activity of reading. It encourages skill development. We encourage them to reread when we point out a particular quote from the text or a particular line from the poem, a particular statement by someone in an expository text. We promote clarification. I don't understand what this means, so do you think it means this? Just engaging in that dialogue in the classroom. It encourages them to do what you as skilled readers do automatically. We do this silently, we do this implicitly. We use context clues to predict. We identify key pieces of information. We ignore irrelevant pieces of information. That is also a skill that we bring to the table. The other thing that modeling and thinking aloud does is it slows down the process for reading. It really gives them time to process what's going on in the text and to think about whether they're getting what the text says or whether we need to apply some fix-up strategies to remedy comprehension breakdowns. So the NRP recommends the use, or rather the explicit instruction of specific comprehension strategies. They particularly have pointed out the usefulness of graphic organizers, summarization strategies, questioning, and again, that's generating and answering questions, as well as comprehension monitoring strategy instruction. So we provide that strategy instruction to our students not because We want them to always go through these 7 or 8 or 10 strategies when they read, but we want them to become strategic readers. And we want them to take those explicit skills and strategies that we're providing them with instruction, and we want them to make that an implicit process so that they too can be they too can become strategic readers, and they can build their reading fluency, their reading comprehension processes in order to gain meaning from the text. So we'll look at the poem's strategy instruction model. So Carlisle and Rice developed this particular methodology back in 2002, and they suggest that we select one of each of these types of strategies as we read. A preparatory strategy, which supports our background knowledge and vocabulary development, engages the reader in the process of reading comprehension. An organizational strategy, so some kind of note-taking methodology or graphic organizer, and we'll go into each of these in detail, which supports working memory by releasing the burden of holding all of the propositions, all of the ideas in their mind, encouraging them to also use those summarization strategies as well as they work through their organizer. Elaborative strategies support those inferential processes that we need in order to be competent readers. Metacognitive strategies supports comprehension monitoring and executive functioning, attending to the task. And then finally, summarizing, which supports knowledge acquisition and synthesis. So we'll take a look at preparatory strategies. So the purpose of preparatory strategies is to activate existing background knowledge, which of course is great if your students have existing background knowledge. They may not have the requisite background knowledge, so there may need to be a classroom discussion that goes on before you engage in the reading of the text. And so a couple of strategies that I think are useful for that. I know we've all seen the KWL chart. What I already know, what I want to know, what I want to learn. This becomes increasingly ineffective with high school students when they tell you they don't want to learn anything because they know it all. However, it's probably a little more practical with younger children. What is useful with high school students and gets them to is the chalk talk, which is one of my favorite activities. You see it here, an example of it here on the bottom on a piece of paper. You can do it on your whiteboard, or if you really actually have a chalkboard, then kudos to you, and you can do it with chalk also. So some idea, some proposition is put up by the teacher that relates to the text that you're about to read. It could be, something about the background knowledge that you need to know in order to engage in the text. You can do this carousel style where you have different propositions around the room, and then in small groups they can go around, but it's a silent activity, so they don't feel the pressure of speaking out and showing that they don't know anything about this topic, right? It gives them the chance to read their classmates' ideas, to think about what their classmates know about the idea, to hopefully make some kind of personal connection to the information that's already been presented by their classmates, and then to make thoughtful contributions based on what they've just read, rather than what they're supposed to know. But it's an effective strategy for engaging their interest on the topic. This is always one of the very favorite days in my high school classroom, both for my students and for me, because it was silent, and because they were very engaged in the process. But it does give them the ability to build the background knowledge if they don't have the prior knowledge, to activate it if they do have it, and to connect to that knowledge as well. So again, our preparatory strategies support background knowledge and vocabulary development. I'll just go back here real quick. If you're, not a person who enjoys a quiet classroom, then Socratic Seminar can also be a great way to engage in this, where you have an inner circle, which would be represented here, and an outer circle. Your inner circle, you might put your more knowledgeable students in that inner circle. They're holding the conversation. Your students in your outer circle are responsible for attending to that conversation, for noting the main ideas, for generating questions to ask the inner circle. And again, that gives every student a chance to engage in the development of that background knowledge, and to think about what they're going to engage in the text. Organizational strategy instruction. So we're talking about graphic organizers, we're talking about charts, we're talking about note-taking. Again, this does support working memory. For narrative texts, perhaps a plot diagram where they can break down the events that are important that occur in the text, where they can describe the characters, Think about the literary devices that are used within that text as they work through the text. So they have it at the beginning, and it's a long process as we add to it every time we read a little bit more. It also works well for expository text, identifying the main idea or the essay topic. The main idea is presented in the essay or the expository text and the supporting details that are presented there. It really gives them a way to break it down visually. You, of course, as the teacher, particularly for the note-taking piece or actually any of these pieces, can provide a scaffolded version of any of these graphic organizers where perhaps you've identified the topic and maybe one of the main ideas, and then the student then knows what they're looking for, and then they can go look for those key details and figure out how that supports the development of the main idea. So you can make these as scaffolded as your individual student needs. So we go on to the elaborative strategy instruction. Elaborative strategy instruction helps our students build inference generation, prediction. It encourages them to question what's going on in the text and their own understanding of what's going on in the text, to use imagery in the process of understanding, and to generate author's purpose. So if you think about imagery, that's something that I found a little bit hard to wrap my head around because I've got a lot of content to instruct, and I don't really want my students sitting there drawing pictures of what's going on in the text. And that's not really what I mean by imagery. If you think about a book that you've loved and that you've read first, and then they've taken it and they've made it into a movie, and they screwed something up. The character doesn't look right. That's not how they're supposed to act. That's not how they're supposed to be. You have created that image of what that character is based on the author's description. And then you see that disconnect there. So when we talk about imagery, that's really what I'm talking about, not necessarily having them draw a picture, because for me that would look very stickish, but for them to engage in the process of building that mental representation of what that character looks like, or if it's an expository text, what the situation looks like perhaps in that part of the world or in that scientific field. You really want them to create that model. And I like the double entry journal for this. You may know this as reader's response, where they're picking a detail or a quote or a word from their reading of any kind of text. It does lend itself very well to narrative text. And then they're responding to that. So we're building those personal connections. We're bringing to bear what they know onto building the model of comprehension of that text. And I think it can be very useful for them. We have monitoring next, monitoring strategy instruction. So self-monitoring, think aloud, strategy choice. I'm sure that you have received encouragement to use close reading as a strategy in your classrooms and text annotation. So it can be having a very simple system. I don't understand this, question mark. I do understand this. Click or clunk is another strategy that falls under comprehension monitoring, where they're literally marking up the text. So we encourage them to scan through the text in a close read the first time, looking for words they don't know or perhaps words they do know. Then we encourage them to read again and identify the main idea or the main people in the text or the excerpt of the text. And then we encourage them to read it yet again and mark their understanding or summarize or predict based on what they're reading. And so what have we gotten them to do? Vocabulary scan, main idea scan or character scan, and then their thoughts on what they're reading. They've read the text 3 times. So rereading is definitely a strategy that we use if we come across a sentence or an idea that we've read through and we get to the end of it and we're like, wow, I can't remember anything about what I've just read. It makes no sense to me. What am I going to do? I'm going to go back and read it more closely. I'm going to pay more attention to it. I'm going to see where my comprehension breaks down. And so making this process explicit for them by having them write on the text, note their sources of confusion, note the ideas that they have about the text, gets them to engage in that process of rereading, and it gives them a very explicit process to work through as they have to go through the text several times. Then our final comprehension strategy instruction is summarizing. Depending on your grade level or your willingness to allow arts and crafts in your classroom, I absolutely adore the supporting idea where they identify the main idea on top and then they put the details that support the main idea underneath. I think that's a great concrete visual for our students to pull ideas out of a text and to assemble them. Certainly we have more conventional ways for them to do that. Having them retell the story and then retell the story or retell the ideas in expository text and then shrink that down into the main ideas and the key points and details, really having them focus in on the most important pieces of information and having them work through that process can be useful to them. And so we alluded to this a little bit earlier when we looked at the simple view of reading. We do want to build comprehension. And for our students who may not have those reading skills in place yet, I really want to encourage you to not only allow but to promote the wide reading of grade level and age level appropriate texts in your classroom. Because even if they're not able to successfully decode that text, they can listen to the text and they can make inferences based on the listening of the text and they can make predictions based on their listening of the text. They can appreciate the figurative language that the author used, the specificity of the vocabulary that the author chose to convey that idea. You can have that conversation about denotation and about connotation. All of those conversations that we love to have in the English language arts classroom, we can have with the oral reading of text. And in doing so, we're building their background knowledge and we're building their vocabulary knowledge. They're encountering that rich vocabulary and we're building their content knowledge if we're talking about reading, even a textbook aloud in order to get the information that we want them to have and to build those comprehension processes. So we want them to build knowledge because background knowledge and reading comprehension are highly correlated. Because what a student already knows highly influences what a student learns. And so if you think back to the example of the below average reader reading something that they are an expert in and understanding it better than the average or high average reader reading that same text with which they have no expertise, it really does influence what we're able to learn. It gives us new places to hang information. It lets us make connections between what we know and what you're trying to get us to learn. So it really does facilitate reading comprehension in that regard. And so we do build knowledge primarily through the process of wide reading or wide listening. It bridges oral language development and reading development, the process of wide reading. It encourages vocabulary growth. So if we look at the study by Anderson, Wilson, and Fielding, and I just want to draw your attention to one number on this chart. For students who read just under 15 minutes a day, they get exposed to over 1 million words a year. And so 15 minutes a day is not even a blip on the radar screen if we consider the amount of time that our students spend engaged in social media, on the phone, video games, on the computer, just to garner 15 minutes of that time and devote it to wide reading or wide listening, depending on the student's decoding ability, can have a tremendous impact on their reading experience, their vocabulary knowledge, and the building of the background knowledge. And that to me seems like a very doable goal, 15 minutes. I can probably do mostly anything for 15 minutes. So it provides exposure to rare words when we engage in wide reading or wide listening. So if we look at Hayes and Aaron's study, we find that when you and I talk to one another, we only generate 17.3 rare words per 100 words. Per 1,000 words. So we're not using very elevated vocabulary when you and I engage in dialogue with one another. In fact, we're right on par with preschool books with rare words of 16.3 per 1,000 words. But then we have double that when we engage in children's books, and double that again when we engage in adult books. Or popular magazines, again, we have that bump. So that is why we generate so much of our vocabulary knowledge through wide reading, because that's where we find rare vocabulary, less frequent vocabulary that has that specific connotation that the author wants to convey. And we use our vocabulary knowledge to build our background knowledge, which of course is crucial for reading comprehension. So we go back to that 15 minutes per day, over 1 million words, in order to elevate our students' vocabulary, to elevate their background knowledge. So getting them to engage in books at their reading level, yes, but also at their grade level, at their maturity level, to push those reading comprehension skills. And don't underestimate the lower, what we would consider the lower children's books. The language there can be very rich, it can be very engaging, and even as an adult, you can read Winnie the Pooh to me and I will be a happy girl. So wherever our students fall, let's get them engaged in the enjoyment, whether it's the wide reading or the wide listening of a variety of texts. So practice isn't the thing that you do once you're good, it's the thing that you do that makes you good. We don't expect this young man to pick up that bow and to divine how to use it and play it beautifully and begin to play like Yo-Yo Ma. We provide him with explicit instruction on bowing technique, on the reading of music. We break it down for him. We give him hours and hours and hours of practice. We do that for B.B. King too. We don't expect this little girl or this little boy to bend it like Beckham or to dunk the basketball without hours of practice, without specific instruction in the skills that you have to have in order to execute on the field. So we really should not expect that of our readers. They also need explicit instruction in the processes that go into reading, into the amount of practice that it takes to become a competent reader. Cognitively complex activities take many years to master because they require that a very long list of situations and possibilities and scenarios be experienced and processed. And when we engage in wide reading, we get experience with those scenarios. We get experience with those situations and the possibilities that are out there. And so we really have to give our students both the explicit, systematic, direct instruction in the basic reading skills as well as reading comprehension processes, skills, and strategies, and then give them the opportunity to engage in wide practice with those skills.